But the main thing that I want to do is to teach you how to destroy this icon of evolution. And we're going to do that with 3 questions. If the river cut the canyon, what cut the side canyons? They're just as deep, but they don't have rivers. So how could they get cut if they didn't have a river? And why did the river cut through the plateau instead of flowing around it? Because it's lower on the edges. And then why did the river cut down into the hard crystalline rock instead of getting wider into the softer rock? And this is how you explain Grand Canyon. You can answer all those questions with bulging and cracking 3 times. Okay, and this is just going to be a cliff notes of my talk. We're just going to fly through it, and then we're going to do some scuba diving later. But this is just a speedboat across the top. Okay, the key to Grand Canyon is you got 2 huge lakes a mile above sea level on the Colorado Plateau. These things are massive. And then once the Grand Lake starts to drain, it cuts down, hits the hard Kaibab limestone, and it spreads out and makes this funnel. It's huge. And then there's no weight on that anymore because there's about 1,000 or 2,000 feet of sediment that's gone. So then that Kaibab limestone bulges and then it cracks. And so then the water gushes through that crack and makes Marble Canyon and undercuts the second lake, Hopi Lake. So now you got 2 lakes that are just catastrophically draining like crazy, sheet eroding all the sediment on top of the Kaibab limestone. And then not only does the Kaibab limestone bulge, but that whole plateau bulges and cracks. And so then the water gushes through that crack, cutting out the Grand Canyon, and it's cutting lower than the water table. So the water table is coming in from the side, and that's how you get the side canyons. And then pretty soon there's nothing pushing down on the Grand Canyon, so the whole basement rock bulges and cracks. So bulging and cracking 3 times, that's how you explain Grand Canyon. Okay, that's the cliff notes of the talk. The talk we're going to look at some facts of the Grand Canyon and what a fact is and what a judgment is. Then we'll ask some questions that you know 3 of them already. And then we'll look and see how the government tries to answer Grand Canyon and they can't. And we'll look at the real explanation, and then we'll do a review. Okay, so let's do that review real quick. If the river cut the canyon, what cut the side canyons? Very good. And then and why did the river cut through the plateau? That's right. And then why did it cut down into the rock instead of getting wider? So those are the 3 questions. Whenever the Grand Canyon comes up, just ask 1 or 2 of them. And the blind chancers are going to have a hard time answering that. And again, bulging and cracking is the way you do it. So here's some facts. And the fact is Grand Canyon exists. Been there, done that, bought the petrified tree. Didn't get the T-shirt, but I got some petrified wood I can show you. And but that's the fact. It's there. How it got there is a conclusion. Now, blind chance conclusion. This is the big bangers and evolutionists. Everything got here by chance. They say that it formed slowly with a little water and a lot of time. Where a creationist says no, it was formed quickly with a lot of water and a little time. And what you have to watch out for is the blind chancers, they like to remove the line between their interpretation and the fact. And they do that all in one sentence. And this is you've seen this before from the college textbook, separate facts from conclusions. A fact is a verifiable piece of information. So it's got to be verifiable. You got to be able to test it. Okay, and whereas a conclusion is a judgment based upon the facts. The news media often mix facts with conclusions without indicating which is which. Well, so does the park system. Notice how they're going to have a fact and a conclusion in the same sentence. Here we go. The park is dominated by the spectacular Grand Canyon, a twisting 1 mile deep and 277 mile long gorge. That's a fact. You can verify it. You can measure it. You can see it. There it is. That's a fact. Comma. Formed during some 6 million years of geological activity and erosion by the Colorado River. Now that's an interpretation. That's a conclusion. That's not a fact. And so we have to be very careful about believing what's a fact and what's not. And whenever you see millions or billions of years, that's not a fact. That's a conclusion. And so last year I went out there to see the facts for myself. And if anybody's interested, creationtoday.org does a great trip. So does thestartingpointproject.com. You fly in on Thursday, you're on the rim on Friday, and on the river on Saturday, and you fly out on Sunday, and you don't buy anything. You just get on the bus and let them park and pay tickets and buy meals. It is the easiest vacation, the most relaxing vacation, and you're surrounded by all these creationists. So much fun. And then we did this walk to fossil beds where you walk there and there's a trilobite fossil. That's a fact. You can see it. Been there, done that. But on the trail they got these things. 3,010 million years ago, 3,200 million years ago. That's an interpretation. They're using what they can to make people believe in millions of years. So that was Friday. This is Saturday. We're getting a raft ride up the river up towards Glen Canyon, see some wild horses. These guys are going to kayak down the river, and that's from a video. Anybody know what this is? That rubble at the bottom of a cliff. That's called talus. And our guide, Mo was her name, she said that's fresh talus. Because, you know, notice how it's black everywhere else? You know, that's made by some microbe or something. It didn't have time to make it black there, so she said that's fresh. And she said you can hear it, you know, especially above the dam in the spring. It sounds like gunshots or explosions, just boom, and then it crumbles in. And you know what's missing? Millions of years of talus. You know, it should be a big V over millions of years. It shouldn't be a canyon. And then you take this little hike about a quarter mile and you see these pictographs, which are kind of fun. And then you can jump in the river if you want. It's real cold, but it's fun. Not Lake Superior cold, but it's refreshing. And then these guys are going to take a picture of this. That's balancing rock or poison rock or whatever they say. And this is how they explain it. And again, whenever you see millions of years, just forget about that. But what was interesting was at that time, Arizona sat near the equator in a tropical environment. And I thought, well, that's interesting. How in the world, I mean, because that's what the hydroplate says. And I thought, I wonder how far Grand Canyon is from the equator. Because there's that 90 East Ridge, which is 3,000 miles, which ripped when the Himalayas rolled towards the equator. And I checked it out, and it said that Arizona was 2,300 miles. And I thought, what about Grand Canyon? And that was 2,500 miles from the equator. So that's getting in that area. And then on Saturday, you go to this Native American reservation. Where was that? Navajo stands and the Manavi dinosaur tracks. You go out and you walk around, and guess what you see? A dinosaur footprint. And this is my footprint next to their footprint, and that's what I wore when I spoke on Sunday. I traveled light that day. Okay, quick review. If the river cut the canyon, what cut the side canyons? And why did it flow through the plateau instead of around it? And why did it cut down instead of wider? Those are the questions that we want you to get. And then bulging and cracking. Okay, so now here's some more facts about the Grand Canyon. It's in northwestern Arizona, and this is fascinating. I love this map here. Wherever you click, you can get the elevation. But in that circle, that's Marble Canyon. That's 61 miles long. It goes from Lee's Ferry down to the Little Colorado River. And that's way different than the Grand Canyon. If you look at that too, there's hardly any side canyons on that one. And Grand Canyon's full of side canyons. So something's different. It's flowing south, and then all of a sudden it flows west. What happened? Notice how that river flows through the Kaibab Plateau there? But do you see how that river goes through that Kaibab Plateau? And that's about a mile above the river. And we'll get to that in a little bit. And then these are the facts from the website. It's the Colorado River inside the national park is 277 miles long. The average width is a football field. The minimum width is a little less than a basketball court. The average depth is 40 feet, and the greatest depth is 85 feet, like from home plate to first base. And then it's got a gradient of 7 feet per mile. These are facts. You can measure them. Anybody can do it, get the same measurement. Those are facts. But then it goes on to say these millions and billions of years ago, and it's a geological record. These are all conclusions. Those are not facts. Those are not verifiable. You can't go back millions of years. But what I wanted to know was, what's the elevation where the river flows in and where the river flows out? I couldn't find it on their website at all. All I could find is that Phantom Ranch is at 2,400 feet, and there it is, right in the middle of the Kaibab Plateau. The website says it descends about 2,000 feet in elevation, okay? But it still doesn't tell me how far. So then you go into this topographic-map.com and you click. I clicked above Glen Canyon Dam, and that was 3,600 feet, and right below it, it's 3,100 feet. And then I went to the end at Lake Mead, that's dammed up by Hoover Dam, and that's 1,200 feet. So you got 3,100 feet here, you got 1,200 feet there, but right in the middle, you got 8,000 feet, the north rim. 8,000 feet. So what you got here is you got a river dropping 2,000 feet from 3,000 to 1,000, and in the middle, the canyon rises a mile up. And so the question is, how does a river flow uphill to cut the canyon? It didn't. The river didn't cut the canyon. The canyon made the river. And then on the south rim, it's 7,400 feet. And if you go a little farther, it's 4,900 feet, and over here it's 6,400 feet. It should have flowed around the bottom, and actually it should have went around the top, 4,300 feet, 5,300 feet. It should have gone around the north. It shouldn't have gone right through the middle where it's high. So why did the river flow through the plateau instead of around it? Okay, and here's some more questions. There was a tour guide who said he used to give tours there, and he'd bring people to the Grand Canyon, and he said, yeah, I dug that. And a little kid asked him, well, where'd you put the dirt? And that question haunted him the rest of his life. Where is that dirt? The delta is way too small for that. And then what force moved 800 cubic miles of sediment for the Grand Canyon? And on the tours, they say 900 cubic miles of sediment. And even before you can cut the Grand Canyon, you got to have the Great Denudation, where you have to move 2,000 cubic miles of sediment. How did that happen? And then before you even do that, you got the Grand Staircase. And this is the blue box right there. We're not talking about that at all tonight. Personal opinion, I'm wondering if maybe some tsunamis after the flood sheet eroded everything there. I don't know. We're just going to be taking a look at what's in the black box. Okay, or in the red box here, you got Grand Canyon on the left, and it's going to go up to Vermilion Cliffs. That's all we're going to be looking at tonight. And yet there's some other erosion features there, which was, I think, 133,000 cubic miles. But personally, I think those might have been tsunamis. I haven't heard a geologist say that, so I could be wrong. Probably am wrong. All right, so if the river cut the canyon, what cut the side canyons? We talked about that. And how a little river cut a canyon 18 miles wide. That's like from here to Foley. You know, why didn't the Mississippi cut a canyon that far? You know, why don't we have these canyons everywhere on Earth? If that all it takes is the river to flow for 6 million years, why don't we have these all over the world? Rivers have been flowing for 6 million years, according to them. And then why are the canyons longer to the north than to the south? They're 2 or 3 times longer to the north than the south. Why is that? And then how did the funnel form? That's just south of Page, Arizona. And once you see that funnel, you can't unsee it. Whatever formed that funnel formed the Grand Canyon. And this funnel is very interesting because it's got barbed canyons. You notice how the Colorado River, that's blue, that's flowing to the southwest, but the barbed canyons in red are flowing to the northeast. How does that happen? And my brother-in-law, he took a geology class at St. Cloud State, and he says this is one thing they could never figure out. It just doesn't make sense for that to happen that way. Of course, they looked at all the theories, and none of them worked. And then on Friday, the professor said, we looked at them all but one. Anybody know what it is? Kid raised his hand and said, no, it's flood. And the professor said, yeah, you're right, but we can't talk about it. So they didn't have an answer, but they wouldn't look at anything that came from the Bible. Okay, and then why are the layers so flat? They're just laying there like pancakes. Why are they so flat and so well sorted into different limestone and sandstone? And then why are there no signs of erosion? On top of the Grand Canyon, there's valleys where there's erosion, but why aren't there valleys scattered throughout all those layers? And then how do slanted layers form under flat layers? Because on the bottom, they're all slanted, but then on top of them, they're flat. How does that happen? And then this is their website. It says layers from the Cambrian, Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, and Permian periods are present. Those are layers from the geologic column. And that's a very misleading statement, because if you don't know what's there, you're going to think, well, yeah, that's just what's there. But what they don't tell you is there's 2 layers that are missing. Why do they ignore the missing Silurian and Ordovician layers? You know, it's why, you know, and they just kind of brush over that. That's huge. That's 72 million years. They're also missing 7 of the 12 layers of the geologic column. See, the geologic column is the New Testament for the blind chancer. That's what they put all their faith in. That dating can't be wrong. The dinosaurs, you can find dinosaur blood in there, but you can't change the date. And then the Old Testament for the blind chancer is the Big Bang. And they'll change that like crazy to make it fit up with modern science. And another question is, why is the Schnevely Hill Formation missing in the Grand Canyon? Because in the Grand Canyon, you got the Coconino Sandstone right on top of the Hermit Formation. But you go 70 miles away, and you got the Schnevely Hill Formation, which is 800 to 1,000 feet thick, and it's separating those two. So why does that happen? And you can see this. You can watch that on Andrew Snelling's How Do Rock Layers Show a Young Earth? It's a really good video, and it's very eye-opening. You know, that geologic column just doesn't work. Okay, and how do potholes form 3,300 feet above the river on a 2,000-foot cliff that's 4 miles away from the river? This is on one of those big cliffs, on Echo Cliffs by the funnel. And Walt Brown says, why was water flowing so rapidly this high, 6,600 feet above sea level, and at the upper edge of a 2,000-foot cliff? That's a tough one. They didn't tell us about that when I was at the Grand Canyon. And they certainly didn't tell me about this rock. How does a 5 to 10 ton rock get raised into a layer of sedimentary rock? That's at Isis Temple. I asked one of the creation guides if he'd want to go to it, and he says, well, I know where it is, but it takes like a day or two of hiking there, and you got to carry your own water. So it's an ordeal. And then why did the river cut into the hard crystalline rock instead of the softer sedimentary rock at Inner Gorge? Okay, and how did Red Butte form? Okay, that's 1,000 feet of Mesozoic sediment capped with volcanic rock. How does that form? And you can see them as you drive down. If you're coming up from Phoenix, you're going to see Red Butte on the right to that highway. And then when you go to Desert Tower, you're going to see this thing, Cedar Mountain. They're real similar. And that's what was over everything. That's what's left of the Great Denudation. Everything else, I mean, that was like that all over those, tens of thousands of miles. It all got washed away somehow. Okay, and this is how the government tries to answer it. Okay, this is the Grand Canyon. It says the story of how Grand Canyon came to be, and it says the story begins about 2 billion years ago. And that reminded me of this geology textbook at St. Cloud State. It says the origin of the geosphere is the story of the birth of our planet. The story begins in an immense cloud. So these are stories that they're teaching you. This isn't science. Science is observable and testable and repeatable. This isn't science. These are stories. And if you miss it at the beginning, you're going to think you're being taught science. But then it goes on and says, scientists know that the Colorado River carved Grand Canyon. How do they know that? Were they there? That's what Ken Ham tells the kids to say. Were you there? They weren't there. This is their interpretation. And it says, today the Kaibab Plateau, a high point through which the river gingerly slices, poses a problem for geologists. Oh, there's a problem. I didn't see that on the placards when I was walking around. It says water certainly doesn't flow uphill. And we talked about that. Yeah, water doesn't flow uphill. And it says, while keeping these few accepted chapters in the Colorado River's history book in mind, there are scientists, geologists that proposed a number of different hypotheses. So what's the main chapter, the plot of the story? The river carved the canyon. That's what they have to have. They can change everything else, but not that. The river carved the canyon. They got 4 theories. This is the Little Colorado River hypotheses from their website. And it says, in order for this theory to work, the ancestral Colorado River would have needed to flow eastward over the Continental Divide. Well, that didn't happen, okay? So throw that one out. And then it says, this is the northwest flowing river hypotheses. In order for this to work, the Kaibab Plateau couldn't look quite like it does today. And it says, unfortunately, no sedimentary deposits have been found to support this theory. So throw that one out. And then this one, spillover theory. The catastrophic draining of ancient lakes. Now, I agree with that. They're on the right trail. They just got the lake at the wrong spot. It says the Colorado River was temporarily dammed behind the Kaibab Plateau. Well, we looked at that. If it was dammed behind the Kaibab Plateau, it should have flowed around the north. That's where it's lowest. It should have gone around the north, not right through it. So throw that one out. And then this is the collapse of a groundwater karst system, and this is a very new idea that's still being developed. Well, if the ground just collapsed, that's not going to make a pothole on that cliff. So throw that one out. And then Forbes even talks about it. The mystery of the Grand Canyon's missing billions of years. Those people who went to the Grand Canyon, did you know there was missing billions of years? Did they show you that? No, I don't think so. It may be solved, okay, but the great unconformity has perplexed geologists since it was first described nearly 150 years ago. 500 million year old Tapete sandstone is directly overlaying the 1.4 to 1.8 billion year old Vishnu schist. And it says, think of the red bluffs and cliffs of the Grand Canyon as Earth's history textbook. You can jump back almost 2 billion years into the planet's past, but that textbook is also missing pages. In some areas, more than 1 billion years worth of rock have disappeared. And so they try to imagine how it happens, and this is what they say, and it may have and likely, and those are fuzzy words, and whenever you see a fuzzy word, you just cross out the sentence, because that's not science. They don't have it. They just will not think of it happening quickly, but we can show how it happened quickly. And this is from their website. I thought they took it down, but I just found it yesterday. It says, perhaps the biggest question of all, how the Colorado River chose this course and began carving the canyon, still awaits a clear answer. Well, I've got a clear answer. And I've submitted it to the park system, and they haven't put it up yet. So I want you guys to start submitting this one too. This is from the hydroplate theory. The theories, or the proposals, are on the top. There's 9 of them. Okay, there's more than just 4. And then the features of Grand Canyon are on the left, and we're talking about why is it here, what's the force and energy and mechanism, and Marble Canyon, and side canyons, and barb canyons. And we're going to talk about all that. And then it's like a stoplight. Green means yes, red means no, and yellow means maybe. And underneath Walt Brown's hydroplate there, it's green all the way down. Everybody else is red and yellow. Okay, and then you can see this for yourself for free. If you go into creationsciencecenter.org, it's a flip book. Just type in page 247, and you'll be able to see this. You'll be able to look. You go into the index, and you'll be able to find a table of contents. Just click on Grand Canyon, and you can see all this stuff yourself. And it's phenomenal. Okay, so again, we're going to review the questions real quick. If the river cut the canyon, what cut the side canyons? Okay, and why did the river cut through the plateau instead of around it? It should have gone around it, it's lower. And why did the river cut down into the hard crystalline rock instead of wider into the softer sedimentary rock at the inner gorge? And again, we answer all that with bulging and cracking 3 times. That's what I want you to walk out of here with. I want you to walk out of here with at least 2 of the 3 questions, and then explaining it with bulging and cracking. So this is how you explain Grand Canyon. This is from the continental drift phase of the hydroplate theory, how they're going. We don't have time to go explain that, but North America is sliding to the west on a friction-free, and it's going to keep going until it meets resistance, and then it's going to buckle up. And so the basement rock buckles. So all these layers are flat, and they're going, and then they buckle. So now the flat layers become slanted, but the layers on top of it keep sliding. So now you're going to have flat layers on top of the slanted layers, which is what they find in Grand Canyon. And one of those sandstone under pressure, I believe, turns into quartzite. And so that big 5 to 10 ton block just got lifted up into the sediment in that mud flow, and then it just sat there. And then the sediment turned into stone. And those are Walt Brown's grandsons. And that's where it is. That's where the coordinates are of it. And it was formed in that layer down below, and yet it got raised up. And that's a real hard one with the blind chancers. Real hard one. Okay, and then that's how you get the flat layers on slanted layers. And then the flat layers, Walt Brown says it's formed by liquefaction. That's when the continents are fluttering, so it's vibrating, and then also tidal waves are, big waves are going across, 200-foot waves are going across the sediment, pushing water in at the crest, and then at the trough it all comes up and then gets pushed down. And he says that'll sort it by size, shape, and density. And that's why there's no erosion marks between them, because they were all sorted. Okay, and then this is from their geologic Grand Canyon website. Over millions of years, these bones, shells, footprints, leaves, and other remains turned into stone. Well, if Randy Galuza was hearing that, he'd say, excuse me, what process today is turning footprints into stone all over the world? What process today is turning leaves into stone? There was something special that happened in the past. And the question you ask is, how did nautiloids stand for 100,000 years? Now, a nautiloid is kind of like a snow cone with a squid sticking out of it. So it's got a shell with a squid. And Steve Austin's done some great research there. He says that I found much of them are oriented in the same direction, and about 15% are standing upright in the rock layers. So they're vertical. Fossils, upright. How does that happen? And then I did the math on that. That red wall limestone is 500 feet thick. And it's supposed to be 50 million years old. So that takes 100,000 years for it to grow 1 foot. And these nautiloids are about 18 inches long. So they're supposed to stand there for 100,000 years and not decompose. And I pointed that out to a professor at St. Cloud State, and she said, yeah, that could happen. I'd like to see that. Okay. Okay, so now you got these 2 lake beds on top of the Colorado Plateau. And that's why all those national parks, that all has something to do with that water and the lake. You look at Arches and Canyonlands and Canyon de Chelly and Monument Valley, that's all on the bottom of Grand Lake. And then Hopi Lake, it's got the petrified forest and it's got the painted desert. And then you got Bryce and Zion outside of the lake, but the water table drained in to make those features because there was a lot of water saturated after the flood. Everything was water saturated. Okay, so Grand Lake, let's take a look at that. It's twice as big as Lake Michigan in size and volume. And then it's a deep lake. If you were in Grand Junction, up in the top right, you'd have 1,100 feet of water on top of you. And Page, Arizona had 1,400 feet of water. And then Farmington, New Mexico is 350 feet of water. And this is a mile in the air, so that's tremendous potential energy. And then you go to Hopi Lake, that's about the size of Lake Huron, and that's roughly 1,000 feet deep all the way through there. And so again, that's tremendous potential energy. And once it went over the top in Grand Lake, there's no stopping it. You know, and it's just gushing over there. That's why you got that fast-moving water on that cliff, because the cliff wasn't there. It's all fast-moving water, and then it eroded that cliff. And this is the funnel that it made. And just to put that in perspective, this is the size of it. This is the side of that funnel. It's roughly 2,000 feet. That's a big funnel that water cut. And those little buildings on the bottom, those are houses. And I don't even think they're all the way back there. I think they're like halfway back. I mean, so that's just a lot of, I mean, it's a huge, huge cliff that got eroded away with a lot of water. And then on the other side, you got Vermilion Cliff. And as we were doing the bus, I think I got a picture of it. Okay, so again, this funnel is 12 miles wide, 18 miles long. Anybody been to Niagara Falls? Yeah, well, this is what Niagara Falls would be like there. Niagara Falls is like 3/4 of a mile. This is 12 miles. And so there's a lot of water that removed all that sediment. So it cut a slot down to the hard Kaibab limestone. That's why it didn't happen right after the flood. It had to get that limestone needed time to get hard. And the cliffs needed time to get hard too, because if it was right after the flood, everything would just slump in. You wouldn't have these big spires and walls. They would have just been a big bowl really instead of a canyon. So anyway, all that sediment was removed, and then there's nothing pushing down on the Kaibab limestone. It's like if you had a waterbed covered with bricks and you remove some bricks, it's going to spring up where the bricks are removed. And that's what happened here. I think they call it isostatic rebound. Okay, so then the Kaibab limestone bulges and it cracks. So then the water gushes through that crack. That's making Marble Canyon, undercuts Hopi Lake, and that's even higher. That's 5,950 feet. And now you got two lakes catastrophically draining, and that's where Red Butte is. It didn't wash away Red Butte. And it didn't wash away Cedar Mountain either. And there's a few more out there too, but that's what was left. But it washed everything else away. And Walt Brown says the waterfall coming out of Hopi Lake was about 13 times higher with possibly 100 times greater flow volume than Niagara Falls. So incredible, and what fast-moving water can do tremendous damage. Just search the Glen Canyon Dam thing. That almost, yeah, I didn't have time to put that in here. But anyhow, so now it just sheet erodes everything. So now not only all that weight is gone, so not only does the Kaibab limestone bulge, but that whole plateau bulges up and then it cracks. So then the water flows through the crack, but as it bulged up too, now the Kaibab upwarp, that's what it technically is, but they all call it a plateau, so that's what I call it. It is raised so the subsurface water flows downhill toward the west and the north. That's how you get the barbed canyons, because the Kaibab Plateau rose up and now the water's gushing to the west and to the north, and then it hits the crack and then it goes to the south and the west. That's how you get the barbed canyons. And you'll notice that the northern rim is 1,000 feet higher than the south rim. And so there's a lot more water to drain from the north than from the south. Hence the canyons are longer to the north than from the south. And so now it's cutting through the softer sedimentary rock and it's getting down, 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 and it gets to the harder crystalline rock, and it should have got wider, but it doesn't. Now there's nothing pushing down on the inner gorge, so now the basement rock bulges and cracks. So bulging and cracking 3 times. That's why it goes through the bottom of that hard rock instead of getting wider into the softer rock. Okay, and this is the inner gorge, and it's right where the Kaibab Plateau bulged up, and that's what bulged too. Okay, and so then to get Cedar Mountain and Red Butte, this is how does a plateau form? Well, the mountains rose up, you got a big mass on a small base, it sinks in, so it squeezes all the magma to the side, and that puts pressure on the side blocks, and then they block fault up. The mechanism is hydraulic lifting, and the force is gravity. And so then it bulges up, and as it bulges up, some of that lava might get to the top and get hard on top of that softer sediment. And then when the lakes are draining, washing all that stuff away during the Great Denudation, it hits that lava, doesn't wash it away. And then this is how you get Red Butte. And that's Red Butte, and then that's real similar to Cedar Mountain. They didn't wash away. That's what's left. So then where did all the dirt go, all the sediment go? Well, there's a huge floodplain, maybe 100 miles on each side of that river. It's just huge, just a flood surge all the way down there. And then you find large rounded boulders that have been found a mile away and 100 feet above the river at Bullhead City. And there's Bullhead City, 200 miles from the Grand Canyon. And yeah, it's rounded boulders. That means it was a fast flow, powerful water that could move them boulders and break off the sharp edges, and then they're surrounded in sand. That meant it stopped quickly. And Walt Brown says when you drive 100 or 200 miles on either side of that river and you look down the gullies, you see these big boulders. So that's a huge floodplain. And Bill Wells, he was a pilot, he said when you take off from San Diego, he says you fly right over the floodplain of the Grand Canyon. Okay, so now a quick review. The fact is Grand Canyon exists. There's two different interpretations, two different conclusions. One is by the blind chancers. They say it formed slowly by a little water and a lot of time. That little Colorado River cut that big canyon over 6 million years. But the creationists say, no, it formed quickly by lots of water in a little time, maybe in a matter of weeks. Okay? And then watch out, they like to erase that line. So when you see something from the government, it might not be true. Just by the way, who trusts the government? Anybody? Okay, that's kind of nonsense. But anyhow, and then also they admit perhaps the biggest question of all, how the Colorado River chose this course and began carving the canyon, still awaits a clear answer. Well, we've got the answer, but it's a biblical answer based on the hydroplate. Hydroplate's based on the Bible, and they don't want that. Okay, so let's do the review real quickly. Okay, if the river cut the canyon, what cut the side canyons? That's right. That's the main question if somebody brings up Grand Canyon. If you need a river to cut the canyon, and there's side canyons are just as deep. It doesn't make sense over millions of years. And why did the river cut through the plateau instead of around it? That's a hard one too. And then why did it cut down into the hard crystalline rock instead of getting wider into the softer sedimentary rock at the inner gorge? So that's bulging and cracking 3 times. The quick review, bulging and cracking, 2 huge lakes a mile above the sea level on the Colorado Plateau. That's why you don't see Grand Canyons everywhere, because you needed them that high with that much potential energy to be able to move that much dirt. And that's why they're not at every river. Okay, 2 huge lakes, and then once it went over Grand Lake, it cut that funnel, cut a slot down, and it got wide. And when it hit the hard Kaibab limestone, and then there's all that weight is gone, so the Kaibab limestone bulged and cracked. That's the first bulging and cracking. The water gushes through that canyon, that's Marble Canyon, and undercuts Hopi Lake. And so now you got 2 lakes catastrophically draining and removing all that sediment. And so then that whole plateau bulges and cracks. That's the second bulging and cracking. And it's cutting below the water table, and the water's coming in gushing in from the side. That's how you get the side canyons. And then it removes 800 cubic miles of sediment from the Grand Canyon. And so now there's nothing pushing down on the basement rock. So that bulges and cracks. That's how it cut down hard and cut into that hard crystalline rock instead of getting wider. Okay, so again, bulging and cracking 3 times. And why do I do this? I want people to think. You know, this is what Thomas Chamberlain said. He warned researchers not to let one hypothesis dominate their thinking. Instead, they should always have or seek multiple working hypotheses. So you can sharpen your analytical skills. You can compare and contrast. You can think independently. Otherwise, you just memorize and conform. And that's what I see a lot of at St. Cloud State, a lot of memorizing and conforming. There's an official narrative, and if you don't see another view of it, You don't think, you just memorize and conform. And Walt Brown says, for a scientific revolution, widespread belief systems seldom change when frequently reinforced by influential institutions such as the universities, media, religious institutions, and the scientific and intellectual elite. You know, they're all pounding the same drum. Because a lot of them, they have their power and prestige. I mean, you get your degree in plate tectonics or the geologic column or whatever. You don't want all that education to go to waste. So you're going to resist something that undermines what you spent your life developing. And so that, okay, so there's power, prestige, money, perks because of the old paradigm. They don't want to let that go. Okay, but he goes on to say, but when a vast number of people realize they've been misled, an intellectual revolution begins. Okay, a vast number of people. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get a vast number of people to realize we've been misled. You know, and it's not millions of years over the Grand Canyon. You know, and it's not evolution. It's not the Big Bang. We've been misled. And then it says that observers of the revolution should note which side avoids a rational scientific debate. Who's willing to be interviewed? Who's willing to debate? And this one, it was rather interesting. There was a guy who had thought that the Grand Canyon formed after the flood, and he, challenged Walt to say, he said, well, where's your evidence that it formed later? And so he said, well, why don't a bunch of geologists go, and I'll show you the evidence that I have. And they agreed to it. And so on July 17th, the first 3 days, I took the group to many of the formations shown. And on the fourth day, when it was the other geologist, or the other guy's turn, to show us the 3 days of evidence he promised, he announced that he had none to show us. Unfortunately, our group had then adjourned 3 days early. So he criticized Walt's theory, and then he couldn't show any evidence to undermine it. And if I understand it right, he then wrote an article criticizing Walt's theory. So the longer I live, the more it doesn't make sense. And what's going to be happening next month? Oh yeah, May 16th, I'm going to debate Jackson Rowe. I was supposed to debate him last year, but he canceled 3 days before. And he says he's been talking to geologists and paleontologists, and he wants another swing at it. So we'll see how he answers those questions. And then I might be debating a geology professor in July. So that'll be interesting, Yeah, we'll see. We'll see if God can use the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And if you want more information on this, go into rsr.org. That's Grand Canyon Month. And Bob Enyart and Brian Nickel go through, and they explain why the river didn't carve the canyon. And they got problems with millions of years, and then they got problems with the flood carved the canyon. Yeah, this book right here, it's in the beginning. It's finally got printed, and it's not available yet, and you can access all of them on a flip book. You just go to creationsciencecenter.org, and you can see the best explanation for Grand Canyon, and you can look at those charts. And you can just go into the table of contents and click on the Grand Canyon, and you can read about it yourself. And then Brian Nickel, he's got a really good one where he animates it. That's available at RSR, and that's for Real Science Radio. And Mike Snavely has Grand Canyon, the puzzle on the plateau, where he has footage of Zion and Bryce. And there's one of them, I think it's Angel's Landing, where you need a permit to go up there. And it's just a chain and a little path, and it's 1,200 feet down off the side. And if you meet somebody there, it's dangerous, so you need a permit to go there. And Mike's done it like 10 times. It's like, good for you. I don't think that's for me. Now it's current events. I like people to have an opportunity to think in a multitude of areas. And the news media and our government don't necessarily give us all the information. So this is last week's High Wire. It talked about strokes are getting younger, the alarming rise in stroke rates among young people, and myocarditis too. And it seems to, from my perspective, back from 2021 when they were forced and they had mandates. And this was the number of deaths in 2021, that's the 21,000, and as time goes by, it gets lower and lower. And then also last week they talked about Pfizer and BioNTech halt U.S. COVID vaccine study after recruitment struggles. They're having a hard time finding people to be part of their studies. And if you know what happened to Maddie DeGarris, you would understand why. And at the end of the month, there's People versus Poison. This is going to be April 27th at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. They are protesting. It's going to the Supreme Court because President Trump gave the glyphosate manufacturers limited liability from. They gave immunity from liability. So if the glyphosate causes cancer or death or something, they can't be sued. And so that's what the Supreme Court is going to be deciding. So again, that's April 27th, and that happened to the vaccines in 1986. And from then on, it seems like our health has gotten a little bit worse every generation. We need multiple theories. We need multiple sources of information. Especially today. I don't know if you heard about this last month, but broadcasters must correct course on news distortions or they don't get their license. So they have to do, and who's going to decide what's true? Well, probably the people that are giving them the license. And so that'd be the government. And I noticed how nobody trusted the government before, and it kind of reminds me of 1984. Who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past. So there's people that get censored that are doing a different narrative. And we saw what that happened in COVID. And then it says the party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was the final, most essential command. And so the question that I've been asking is, hey, why will Iran be different than Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam? You know, before we start, and they've increased the age of enlistment to 42 now. It went from 34 to 42. And it's like, are they planning a draft? I don't know. Yeah. So, you know, that's what I don't want. I'm trying to get as many people to get as much information as you can, because there's going to be a narrative that pushes in that direction. There's going to be a narrative that pushes in the other direction. And we need to see both narratives if we want to think for ourselves, because I don't want to send kids over there to die. Okay, and then, you know, Trump said we should listen to Mark Levine. And he's got, what, 95,000 subscribers, and people like 2,000, 4,000 people listen. But again, that's one source of information. Get another source, you know, listen to Tucker. You know, and there's a censoring mechanism that's happening right now. Have them listen to the Carrie Prejean Bowler interview. She was on the Religious Liberty Commission, and she got thrown off for practicing her liberty. And the other interviews that are good are like Mike Huckabee and Ted Cruz. And let's see here. Yeah, that would make sense. I'd like to see a debate issue or interview where both sides can present both sides. You know, I can see both sides and come to my own conclusion. I don't like it when only one idea is presented. And Judge Napolitano, he's got some good interviews, and you hear some different up-to-date stuff, like I think it's Colonel McGregor, because a lot of the stuff you're not seeing on. And then this one's Valhalla. He's a Green Beret. And he's still got friends in the service, so he's got some inside scoop. And I just want people to get a variety of information. And Ron Paul, he's been banging that drum for a long time. And Jimmy Dore's got some interviews. And Piers Morgan, he'll have both sides on, and you can hear both sides. And I think it's very important that we see both sides, especially if there's going to be a draft, like he said. And I wake up at night thinking about this stuff. And then I have to remember what Corrie ten Boom said. She said, if you look at the world, you'll be distressed. If you look within, you'll be depressed. But if you look at Christ, you'll be at rest. So then when I wake up, I got a little Bible player, and I just start playing the Bible. God's in charge. This world's, I don't know, it seems to be spiraling out of control, but hopefully, you know, we get enough people in the lifeboat as we can. So again, bulging and cracking 3 times. Thank you so much for the attention. We appreciate that.